The following is from the book Billions and Billions. This is the chapter Abortion. Is it possible to be both pro-life and pro-choice? Written by the great Carl Sagan and the great Ann Druyan. Mankind likes to think in terms of extreme opposites. It is given to formulating its beliefs in terms of either-ors, between which it recognizes no intermediate possibilities. When forced to recognize that the extremes cannot be acted upon, it is still inclined to hold that they are all right in theory, but that when it comes to practical matters, circumstances compel us to compromise. John Dewey, Experience in Education, 1938. The issue had been decided years ago. The court had chosen the middle ground. You'd think the fight was over. Instead, there are mass rallies, bombings and intimidation, murders of workers at abortion clinics, arrests, intense lobbying, legislative drama, congressional hearings, Supreme Court decisions, major political parties almost defining themselves on the issue, and clerics threatening politicians with perdition. Partisans fleeing accusations of hypocrisy and murder. The intent of the Constitution and the will of God are equally invoked. Doubtful arguments are trotted out as certitudes. The contending factions call upon science to bolster their positions. Families are divided. Husbands and wives agree not to discuss it. Old friends are no longer speaking. Politicians check the latest polls to discover the dictates of their consciences. Amid all the shouting, it is hard for the adversaries to hear one another. Opinions are polarized. Minds are closed. Is it wrong to abort a pregnancy? Always? Sometimes? Never? How do we decide? We wrote this article to understand better what the contending views are and to see if we ourselves could find a position that would satisfy us both. Is there no middle ground? We had to weigh the arguments of both sides for consistency and to pose test cases, some of which are purely hypothetical. If in some of these tests we seem to go too far, we ask the reader to be patient with us. We're trying to stress the various positions to the breaking point to see their weaknesses and where they fail. In contemplative moments, nearly everyone recognizes that the issue is not wholly one-sided. Many partisans of differing views, we find, feel some disquiet, some unease when confronting what's behind the opposing arguments. This is partly why such confrontations are avoided. And the issue surely touches on deep questions. What are our responsibilities to one another? Should we permit the state to intrude into the most intimate and personal aspects of our lives? Boundaries of freedom. What does it mean to be human? Of the many actual points of view, it is widely held, especially in the media, which rarely have the time or the inclination to make fine distinctions, that there are only two, pro-choice and pro-life. This is what the two principal warring camps like to call themselves, and that's what we'll call them here. In the simplest characterization, a pro-choicer would hold that the decision to abort a pregnancy is to be made only by the woman. The state has no right to interfere. And a pro-lifer would hold that, from the moment of conception, the embryo or fetus is alive, that this life imposes on us a moral obligation to preserve it, and that abortion is tantamount to murder. Both names, pro-choice and pro-life, were picked up with an eye toward influencing those whose minds are not yet made up. Few people wish to be counted either as being against freedom of choice or as opposed to life. Indeed, freedom and life are two of our most cherished values. Here they seem to be in fundamental conflict. Let's consider these two absolutist positions in turn. A newborn baby is surely the same thing as it was just before birth. There's good evidence that a late-term fetus responds to sound, including music, but especially its mother's voice. It can suck its thumb or do a somersault. Occasionally, it generates adult brainwave patterns. Some people claim to remember being born, even the uterine environment. Perhaps there is thought in the womb. It's hard to maintain that a transformation of full personhood happens abruptly at the moment of birth. Why, then, should it be murder to kill an infant the day after it was born but not the day before? As a practical matter, this isn't very important. Less than 1% of all tabulated abortions in the United States are listed in the last 3 months of pregnancy. And on closer investigation, most such reports turn out to be due to miscarriage or miscalculation. But third trimester abortions provide a test of the limits of the pro-choice point of view. Does a woman's innate right to control her own body encompass the right to kill a near-term fetus who is, for all intent and purposes, identical to a newborn child? We believe that many supporters of reproductive freedom are troubled at least occasionally by this question, but they are reluctant to raise it because it is the beginning of a slippery slope. If it is impermissible to abort a pregnancy in the 9th month, what about the 8th, 7th, 6th? Once we acknowledge that the state can interfere at any time in the pregnancy, doesn't it follow that the state can interfere at all times? This conjures up the specter of predominantly male, predominantly affluent legislators telling poor women that they must bear and raise alone children they cannot afford to bring up. forcing teenagers to bear children that they are not emotionally prepared to deal with, saying to women who wish for a career that they must give up their dreams, stay home, and bring up babies, and worst of all, condemning victims of rape and incest to carry and nurture the offspring of their assailants. Footnote. Two of the most energetic pro-lifers of all time were Hitler and Stalin, who immediately upon taking power criminalized previously legal abortions. Mussolini, Ceausescu, and countless other nationalist dictators and tyrants have done likewise. Of course, this is not by itself a pro-choice argument, but it does alert us to the possibility that being against abortion may not always be part of a deep commitment to human life. Legislative prohibitions on abortion arouse the suspicion that their real intent is to control the independence and sexuality of women. Why should legislators have any right at all to tell women what to do with their bodies? To be deprived of reproductive freedom is demeaning. Women are fed up with being pushed around. And yet, by consensus, all of us think it proper that there be prohibitions against and penalties exacted for murder. It would be a flimsy defense if the murderer pleads that this is just between him and his victim and none of the government's business. If killing a fetus is truly killing a human being, is it not the duty of the state to prevent it? Indeed, one of the chief functions of government is to protect the weak from the strong. If we do not oppose abortion at some stage of pregnancy, is there not a danger of dismissing an entire category of human beings as unworthy of our protection and respect? And isn't that dismissal the hallmark of sexism, racism, nationalism, and religious fanaticism? Shouldn't those dedicated to fighting such injustices be scrupulously careful not to embrace another? There is no right to life in any society on earth today, nor has there been in any former time, with few rare exceptions such as among the Jains of India. We raise farm animals for slaughter, destroy forests, pollute rivers and lakes until fish can no longer live there, kill deer and elk for sport, leopards for their pelts, and whales for fertilizer, entrap dolphins, gasping and writhing in great tuna nets, club seal pups to death, and render a species extinct every day. All of these beasts and vegetables are as alive as we. What is allegedly protected is not life, but human life. And even with that protection, casual murder is an urban commonplace, and we wage conventional wars with tolls so terrible that we are, most of us, afraid to consider them very deeply. Tellingly, state-organized mass murders are often justified by redefining our opponents by race, nationality, religion, or ideology as less than human. That protection or right to life eludes the 40,000 children under 5 who die on our planet each day from preventable starvation, dehydration, disease, and neglect. Those who assert a right to life are for, at most, not just any kind of life, but for particularly and uniquely human life. So they too, like pro-choicers, must decide what distinguishes a human being from other animals and when, during gestation, the uniquely human qualities, whatever they are, emerge. Despite many claims to the contrary, life does not begin at conception. It is an unbroken chain that stretches back nearly to the origin of the earth, 4.6 billion years ago. Nor does human life begin at conception. It is an unbroken chain dating back to the origin of our species, hundreds of thousands of years ago. Every human sperm and egg is, beyond the shadow of a doubt, alive. They are not human beings, of course. However, it could be argued that neither is a fertilized egg. In some animals, an egg develops into a healthy adult without the benefit of a sperm cell, but not so far as we know among humans. A sperm and an unfertilized egg jointly comprise the full genetic blueprint for a human being. Under certain circumstances, after fertilization, they can develop into a baby. But most fertilized eggs are spontaneously miscarried. Development into a baby is by no means guaranteed. Neither a sperm or an egg separately, nor a fertilized egg, is more than a potential baby or a potential adult. So if a sperm and egg are as human as the fertilized egg produced by their union, and if it is murder to destroy a fertilized egg despite the fact that it's only potentially a baby, why isn't it murder to destroy a sperm or an egg? Hundreds of millions of sperm cells, top speed with tails lashing 5 inches per hour, are produced in an average human ejaculation. A healthy young man can produce in a week or two enough spermatozoa to double the human population of the earth. So is masturbation mass murder? How about nocturnal emissions or just plain sex? When the unfertilized egg is expelled each month, has someone died? Should we mourn all those spontaneous miscarriages? Many lower animals can be grown in a laboratory from a single body cell. Human cells can also be cloned, perhaps the most famous being the Hela clone, named after the donor Helen Lane. In light of such cloning technology, will we be committing mass murder by destroying any potentially clonable cells by shedding a drop of blood? All human sperm and eggs are genetic halves of potential human beings. Should heroic efforts be made to save and preserve all of them everywhere because of this potential? Is failure to do so immoral or criminal? Of course, there's a difference between taking a life and failing to save it. And there's a big difference between the probability of a survival of a sperm cell and that of a fertilized egg. But the absurdity of a core of high-minded semen preservers moves us to wonder whether a fertilized egg's mere potential to become a baby really does not make destroying it murder. Opponents of abortion worry that, once abortion is permissible immediately after conception, no argument will restrict it at any later time in the pregnancy. Then, they fear, one day it will be permissible to murder a fetus that is unambiguously a human being. Both pro-choicers and pro-lifers, at least some of them, are pushed towards absolutist positions by parallel fears of the slippery slope. Another slippery slope is reached by those pro-lifers who are willing to make an exception in the agonizing case of a pregnancy resulting from rape or incest. But why should the right to live depend on the circumstances of the conception? If the same child were to result, can the state ordain life for the offspring of a lawful union but death for one conceived by force or coercion? How can this be just? And if the exceptions are extended to such a fetus, why should they be withheld from any other fetus? This is part of the reason why some pro-lifers adopt what many others consider the outrageous posture of opposing abortion under any and all circumstances, only accepting, perhaps, when the mother's life is in danger. Footnote: Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, opposed even this exception, saying, quote, "If they become tired or even die through bearing children, that does not matter. Let them die through fruitfulness. That is why they are here." End quote. Luther vom Ehelichen Leben, 1522. By far, the most common reason for abortion worldwide is birth control. So shouldn't opponents of abortion be handing out contraceptives and teaching school children how to use them? That would be an effective way to reduce the number of abortions. Instead, the United States is far behind other nations in the development of safe and effective methods of birth control. And in many cases, opposition to such research and to sex education has come from the same people who oppose abortions. Footnote: Likewise, shouldn't pro-lifers count birthdays from the moment of conception and not the moment of birth? Shouldn't they closely interrogate their parents on their real sexual history? There would, of course, be some irreducible uncertainty. It may take hours or days after the sex act for conception to happen, a particular difficulty for pro-lifers who wish to dally with sun sign astrology. The attempt to find an ethically sound and unambiguous judgment of when, if ever, abortion is permissible has deep historical roots. Often, especially in the Christian tradition, such attempts were connected with the question of when the soul enters the body, a matter not readily amenable to scientific investigation and an issue of controversy even among learned theologians. Ensoulment has been asserted to occur in the sperm before conception, at the time of quickening, when the mother is first able to feel the fetus stirring within her, and at birth, or even later. Different religions have different teachings. Among hunter-gatherers, there are usually no prohibitions against abortion, and it was common in ancient Greece and Rome. In contrast, the more severe Assyrians impaled women on stakes for attempting abortion. The Jewish Talmud teaches that the fetus is not a person and has no rights. The Old and New Testaments, rich in astonishingly detailed prohibitions on dress, diet, and permissible words, contain not a word specifically prohibiting abortion. The only passage that's remotely relevant, Exodus 21 and 22, decrees that if there's a fight and a woman bystander should accidentally be injured and made to miscarry, the assailant must pay a fine. Neither St. Augustine nor St. Thomas Aquinas considered the early term abortion to be homicide, the latter on the grounds that the embryo doesn't look human. The view was embraced by the Church in the Council of Vienne in 1312 and has never been repudiated. The Catholic Church's first and long-standing collection on canon law, according to the leading historian of the Church's teaching on abortion, John Connery S.J., held that abortion was homicide only after the fetus was already formed, roughly at the end of the first trimester. But when sperm cells were examined in the 17th century by the first microscopes, they were thought to show a fully formed human being. An old idea of the homunculus was resuscitated, in which within each sperm cell was a fully formed tiny human, within whose testes were innumerable other homunculi, etc. ad infinitum. In part through this misinterpretation of scientific data, in 1869 abortion at any time for any reason became grounds for excommunication. It is surprising to most Catholics and others to discover that the date was not much earlier. From colonial times to the 19th century, the choice in the United States was a woman's until quickening. An abortion in the first or even second trimester was at worst a misdemeanor. Convictions were rarely sought and almost impossible to obtain because they depended entirely on a woman's own testimony of whether she felt quickening, and because of the jury's distaste for prosecuting a woman for exercising her right to choose. In 1800, there is not, so far as is known, a single statute in the United States concerning abortion. Advertisements for drugs to induce abortion could be found in virtually every newspaper and even in some church publications, although the language used is suitably euphemistic, if widely understood. But by 1900, abortion had been banned at any time in pregnancy by every state in the Union, except when necessary to save the woman's life. What happened to bring about so striking a reversal? Religion had little to do with it. Drastic economic and social conversions were turning the country from an agrarian to an urban industrial society. America was in the process of changing from having one of the highest birth rates in the world to one of the lowest. Abortion certainly played a role and stimulated forces to suppress it. One of the most significant of these forces was the medical profession. Up to the mid-19th century, medicine was an uncertified, unsupervised business. Anyone could hang up a shingle and call himself or herself a doctor. With the rise of a new university-educated medical elite, anxious to enhance the status and influence of physicians, the American Medical Association was formed. In its first decade, the AMA began lobbying against abortions performed by anyone except for licensed physicians. New knowledge of embryology, the physicians said, had shown the fetus to be human even before quickening. Their assault on abortion was motivated not by a concern for the health of the woman, but they claimed for the welfare of the fetus. You had to be a physician to know when abortion was morally justified because the question depended on scientific and medical facts understood only by physicians. At the same time, women were effectively excluded from the medical schools where such arcane knowledge could be acquired. So, as things worked out, women had almost nothing to say about terminating their own pregnancies. It was also up to the physician to decide if the pregnancy posed a threat to the woman, and it was entirely at his discretion to determine what was and what was not a threat. For the rich woman, the threat might be a threat to her emotional tranquility or even to her lifestyle. The poor woman was often forced to resort to the back alley or the coat hanger. This was the law until the 1960s, when a coalition of individuals and organizations, the AMA now among them, sought to overturn it and to reinstate the more traditional values that were to be embodied in Roe v. Wade. If you deliberately kill a human being, it's called murder. If you deliberately kill a chimpanzee, biologically our closest relative sharing 99.6% of our active genes, whatever else it is, it's not murder. To date, murder uniquely applies to killing human beings. Therefore, the question of when personhood, or if we like, ensoulment, arises is key to the abortion debate. When does the fetus become human? When do distinct characteristic human qualities emerge? We recognize that specifying a precise moment will overlook individual differences. Therefore, if we must draw a line, it ought to be drawn conservatively. That is, on the early side. There are people who object to having to set some numerical limit, and we share their disquiet. But if there is to be a law on this matter, and it is to effect some useful compromise between two absolutist positions, it must specify at least roughly a time of transition to personhood. Every one of us began from a dot. A fertilized egg is roughly the size of a period at the end of the sentence. The momentous meeting of sperm and egg generally occurs in one of the two fallopian tubes. One cell becomes two, two become four, and so on, an exponentiation of base 2 arithmetic. By the 10th day, the fertilized egg has become a kind of hollow sphere wandering into another realm, the womb. It destroys tissue in its path. It sucks blood from the capillaries. It bathes itself in maternal blood, from which it extracts oxygen and nutrients. It establishes itself as kind of a parasite on the walls of the uterus. By the 3rd week, around the time of the first missed menstrual period, the forming embryo is about 2 millimeters long and is developing various body parts. Only at this stage does it begin to be dependent on rudimentary placenta. It looks a little like a segmented worm. By the end of the 4th week, it's about 5 millimeters or about 1/5 of an inch long. It's recognizable now as a vertebrate. Its tube-shaped heart is something to beat. Something like gill arches of a fish or amphibian become conspicuous, and there is a pronounced tail. It looks rather like a newt or tadpole. This is the end of the first month after conception. By the 5th week, the gross divisions of the brain can be distinguished. What will later develop into eyes are apparent, and little buds appear on their way to becoming arms and legs. By the 6th week, the embryo is 13 millimeters or half an inch long. The eyes are still on the side of the head, as in most animals, and the reptilian face has connected slits where the mouth and nose will eventually be. By the end of the 7th week, the tail is almost gone and the sexual characteristics can be discerned, although both sexes look female. The face is mammalian, but somewhat pig-like. By the end of the 8th week, the face resembles that of a primate, but is still not quite human. Most of the human body parts are present in their essentials. Some lower brain anatomy is well developed. The fetus shows some reflex response to delicate stimulation. By the 10th week, the face has an unmistakably human cast. It is beginning to be possible to distinguish males from females. Nails and major bone structures are not apparent until the 3rd month. By the 4th month, you can tell the face of one fetus from that of another. Quickening is most commonly felt in the 5th month. The bronchioles of the lungs do not begin developing until approximately the 6th month, the alveoli still later. So, if only a person can be murdered, when does the fetus attain personhood? When its face becomes distinctly human near the end of the 1st trimester? When the fetus becomes responsive to stimuli, again at the end of the 1st trimester? When it becomes active enough to be felt as quickening, typically in the middle of the 2nd trimester? When the lungs have reached a stage of development sufficient that the fetus might just conceivably be able to breathe on its own in the outside air? The trouble with these particular developmental milestones is not just that they're arbitrary. More troubling is the fact that none of them involves uniquely human characteristics, apart from the superficial matter of facial appearance. All animals respond to stimuli and move on their own volition. Large numbers are able to breathe, but that doesn't stop us from slaughtering them by the billions. Reflexes and motion and respiration are not what make us human. Other animals have advantages over us in speed, strength, endurance, climbing or burrowing skills, camouflage, sight or smell or hearing, mastery of the air or water. Our one great advantage, the secret of our success, is thought, characteristically human thought. We're able to think things through, imagine events yet to occur, figure things out. That's how we invented agriculture and civilization. Thought is our blessing and our curse. It's what makes us who we are. Thinking occurs, of course, in the brain, principally in the top layers of the convoluted gray matter called the cerebral cortex. The roughly 100 billion neurons in the brain constitute the material basis of thought. The neurons are connected to each other, and their link-ups play a major role in what we experience as thinking. But large-scale linking up of neurons doesn't begin until the 24th to 27th week of pregnancy, the 6th month. By placing harmless electrodes on the subject's head, scientists can measure the electrical activity produced by a network of neurons inside the skull. Different kinds of mental activity show different kinds of brain waves, but brain waves with regular patterns typical of adult human brains do not appear in the fetus until the 30th week of the pregnancy, near the beginning of the 3rd trimester. Fetuses younger than this, however alive and active they may be, lack the necessary brain architecture. They cannot yet think. Acquiescing in the killing of any living creature, especially one that might later become a baby, is troublesome and painful. But we've rejected the extremes of always and never, and that puts us, like it or not, on the slippery slope. We are forced to choose a developmental criterion. Then this is where we draw the line, when the beginning of characteristically human thinking becomes barely possible. It is, in fact, a very conservative definition. Regular brainwaves are rarely found in fetuses. More research would help. Well-defined brainwaves in fetal baboons and fetal sheep also begin only late in gestation. If we wanted to make the criterion still more stringent to allow for more occasional precocious fetal brain development, we might draw the line at 6 months. This, it so happens, is where the Supreme Court drew it in 1973, although for completely different reasons. Its decision in the case of Roe v. Wade changed American law on abortion. It permits abortion at the request of the woman without restriction of the 1st trimester and with some restrictions intended to protect her health in the 2nd. It allows states to forbid abortion in the 3rd trimester, except when there's a serious threat to the life or health of the woman. In the 1989 Webster decision, the Supreme Court declined explicitly to overturn Roe v. Wade, but in effect invited the 50 state legislators to decide for themselves. What was the reasoning in Roe v. Wade? There was no legal weight given to what happens to the children once they are born, or to the family. Instead, a woman's right to reproductive freedom is protected, the court ruled, by constitutional guarantees of privacy. But that right is not unqualified. The woman's guarantee of privacy and the fetus's right to life must be weighed, and when the court did the weighing, priority was given to privacy in the 1st trimester and to life in the 3rd. The transition was decided not from any of the considerations that we have been dealing with so far in this chapter, not when ensoulment occurs, not when the fetus takes on sufficient human characteristics to be protected by laws against murder. Instead, the criterion adopted was whether the fetus could live outside the mother. This is called viability and depends in part on the ability to breathe. The lungs are simply not developed, and the fetus cannot breathe, no matter how advanced an artificial lung it might have been placed in, until about the 24th week near the start of the 6th month. This is why Roe v. Wade permits the states to prohibit abortions in the last trimester. It's a very pragmatic criterion. If the fetus at a certain stage of gestation would be viable outside the womb, the argument goes, then the right of the fetus to life overrides the right of the woman to privacy. But just what does viable mean? Even a full-term newborn is not viable without a great deal of care and love. There was a time before incubators, only a few decades ago, when babies in their 7th month were unlikely to be viable. Would aborting in the 7th month have been permissible then? After the invention of incubators, did aborting pregnancies in the 7th month become subtly immoral? What happens if in the future a new technology develops so that an artificial womb can sustain a fetus even before the 6th month by delivering oxygen and nutrients through the blood, as the mother does through her placenta and fetal blood system? We grant that this technology is unlikely to be developed soon and become available to many. But if it were available, does it become immoral to abort earlier than the 6th month when it was previously moral? A morality that depends on and changes with technology is a fragile morality. For some, it is also an unacceptable morality. And why exactly should breathing or kidney function or the ability to resist disease justify legal protection? If a fetus can be shown to think and feel but not be able to breathe, would it be all right to kill it? Do we value breathing above thinking and feeling? Viability arguments cannot, it seems to us, coherently determine when abortions are permissible. Some other criterion is needed. Again, we offer for consideration the earliest onset of human thinking as that criterion. Since, on average, fetal thinking occurs even later than fetal lung development, we find Roe v. Wade to be a good and prudent decision addressing a complex and difficult issue. With prohibitions on abortion in the last trimester, except in cases of grave medical necessity, it strikes a fair balance between the conflicting claims of freedom and life. And kind of a footnote. When this article appeared in Parade, it was accompanied by a box giving a 900 telephone number for readers to express their views on the abortion issue. An astonishing 380,000 people called in. They were able to express the following 4 options. 1. Abortion after the instant of conception is murder. 2. A woman has the right to choose abortion at any time during the pregnancy. 3. Abortion should be permitted within the first 3 months of pregnancy. And 4. Abortion should be permitted within the first 6 months of pregnancy. Parade is published on Sunday, and by Monday, opinions were well divided among the 4 options. Then Mr. Pat Robertson, a Christian fundamentalist, evangelist, and 1992 Republican presidential candidate, appeared Monday on his regularly scheduled daily television program, urged his followers to pull Parade out of the garbage and send back the clear message that killing a human zygote is murder. They did. The generally pro-choice attitude of most Americans, as repeatedly shown in demographically controlled opinion polls, as it had been reflected by the early 900 number results, was overwhelmed by political organization. This was from the book Billions and Billions, the chapter Abortion, Is It Possible to Be Both Pro-Life and Pro-Choice by Carl Sagan and Ann Druyan, published in Parade Magazine, April 22, 1990. The absurdity of a corps of high-minded semen perverters